There was a local writing contest for a short story, and a close friend of mine and a spiritual guide for me suggested, well, write something about the most painful time in your life. That made me stop for a while because I couldn't really answer that question. Like, what was the most painful moment in my life? And after, meditating on it and going for long walks, I started to realize that it was the night that I walked away from my twins in Berlin. Germany isn't what it was when I grew up. It's not the same country anymore. It's not the same culture anymore. It's not even the same language anymore. Right? Like, I think one of the things that all human beings currently deal with is the motion sickness we're experiencing just from the acceleration of change in the last 10 years. I mean, things are changing so quickly around us that, it's impossible to keep track. And the force that's accelerating is not human. And it also doesn't have, it's not well-meaning towards human either. I think we're all starting to feel that. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what cultural background you're from, right? I mean, just some hard facts. So I grew up, like, my parents are from the northeast of Germany, Prussia. They ran away in 59 when they were 19 before the wall was built. So they were ultimately, war refugees, lost everything in the process, resettled in northern Bavaria. Everybody in northern Bavaria knew I wasn't from there. I'm too tall, I have a northern German name, and I do not speak the right accent. So I was already an immigrant there, but I got I guess pulled into or socialized by the broader German fabric, which one of the key aspects of the German cultural fabric is that there is no homeschooling. You are not allowed to homeschool your kids. Everybody goes to the same public school, and so it provides a common ground of understanding, right? I make my living in cybersecurity in the corporate world. And I like to joke when I work with Americans a lot, and I always like to joke about how Germans always get pulled across the table by Americans because they can't even imagine how scrupulous they are. Right? Because the Germans all grow up in one cultural kind of like setting, and they assume everybody else behaves that way, and then it takes some time to figure out that that's not the case. But now I've been, in Canada for almost as long as I've been in Germany. So who I am changes very much to where I am, right? So when I'm back in Germany, tending to my aging parents, I very much feel like I'm a different person during that time because, I speak a different language. I lean into the way and the rhythm of how people interact over there. And, in my work, I interact with people from all around the world. I interact with a lot of Indians in IT, Europeans, Americans, Chinese, Japanese. In Germany, good friends get involved in your private life, right? They will take you aside and they will tell you when they think you're making bad decisions and you're going down a bad path or you're talking bullshit. I find that Canadians have it's people get offended very quickly here. You have to be very careful if you make any kind of judgment about a personal choice, because that's the key difference. And when you're raising children like that, right? Because the other children run around thinking that, well, this is my personal choice. I should have the right to do that. I should, dress, do whatever. And I raise my children differently. I've come to the conclusion that it's simply a function of population density. So when there's too many humans on close space together, and you see this in North America in cities, it's the same thing, right? If you look at some of the conflicts between like the Democrats and the Republicans, you can see that many of the values that the Democrats hold dear are values of people that live in cities closely together, and they need to negotiate public space and public buildings and public services that you don't need to negotiate if there's only one person every square kilometer, right? But I think I digress too much. But this, I can't really, it's not so easy to like pin that down as to like, where does culture stop? Where am I? Like, what's the effect of the work that I do, on me? Um, I'm not sure I have a very like cohesive, clear answer for you on that. I mean, when I look like at the big stages of my life, right? So after I graduated from high school, I moved to Berlin during the 90s. I became a raver, became pretty immersed into the rave club culture there, which was, an euphoric expression of like the 90s, right? The wall had just come down, democracy had won, the internet was starting, democratization of everything, everybody loves everybody, like it seemed like we could do nothing wrong, right? So it was this euphoric, shared joy everywhere. So that were my 90s. Then in the late 90s, I moved to the States, trying to make some money. And then shortly after, I deeply fell in love with a Canadian woman, my wife, Candice, and we got married. And that was after spending 10 years as in a very promiscuous culture, right? Like in the rave culture, was and all of that. I hear this now. I try to pay as little bit attention to it as I can, but I certainly know that it's a big topic among young people now. Not having any ties and not making any commitments and being free. And I'm like, I've lived through all of that. I've lived it. I know the consequences. I know what it creates. I know what it feels like, and I know the traps, that are laid out for you with like all kinds of predators on the sidelines trying to like, make money off of your confusion, right? Then I became a father. And once there were these magic little beings in front of me, everything changed, right? It was it was a shift in me that was beyond, my mental capacity, who I am. There was like it really felt like the hand of a higher power is now guiding my life, and I now have the responsibility for these children, and to some degree, you know, for the entire family, right? And so that shifted everything in me. And then when the kids were a certain age, 2, 3 years old, I started to want to grow things. I never thought about this before, but I started with just very simple things like growing spices on my balcony in Toronto. We were living in Toronto at the time, up at beaches, and I would just get some gardening pots and grow my spices. And I've always liked to cook. I was introduced to cooking by an Italian roommate when I lived in Berlin, and then from there it expanded, and I loved what it brought to my life. Amongst other things, it gave me a chance to reconnect with my mother, because my mother used to be the gardener in our family. And I remember times when I was, 9, 10 years old, and I would just play outside all day long. I wouldn't even come in. I would go straight in the garden. I'd eat something out of the garden. I wouldn't even come in the house. And this kind of like gently rose in my consciousness as something that I would love to do that. And so I just did. But I mean, all this ability, I think, that I had to just kind of like accept these gentle nudges of, you know, ether, the universe, God, whatever you want to call it, didn't come out of nowhere, right? At that point, I had already been meditating regularly for 10 years, because, by my late 20s, I was struggling with stress and, pain in my my back. I'm tall, just like you are, so a lot of back pain, neck pain, headaches. And I used to be an athlete when I was young, so it wasn't difficult for me to do the physical stuff, but mentally, I was just trapped in my head. Like I was incessantly thinking. Because one of the Western education system, and I think it's more pronounced in Germany, was that logic thinking, right? And so I was just suffering from incessant thinking, couldn't stop to think. And so and the internal tyrant, right? Shattering voice that comments and judges everything constantly, right? Becomes so. It took me a few years just to learn how to quiet that. And then when I experienced the joy that brought me, and the peace and the relaxation and the beauty that it brought to my life, I started to trust that which comes to me beyond the thoughts. When these kind of intuitive realizations came to me, they sounded completely different than a thought, right? They also came from a different spot than I thought. Like they come from like the center of my body and rise up versus thoughts that are in the head, right? They sound gentle in their voice, and they're very brief sentences, right? There's not a lot of babble going on. They're very brief sentences, and they just kind of validate things that I want to do, or say, give me a guidance on and I don't want to give the impression that this is a constant dialogue, right? Like it can go for 6 months without me having any kind of insights, and I just sit in meditation and I just watch my thoughts, and I'm like, well, that's interesting. But what I've realized over those years is that what I'm really doing is I am trying hard to feel human in this world that we live in, to just actually have a human experience. Raising 3 boys, right? We have, my wife and I, we have 3 boys. The first one is out of the house now. Second one is 17, and then we have a 14-year-old. And witnessing the things that they are faced with every day, and then what the culture deems, good for them to do, like play computer games hours, on end. You can see that there's a massive force that's really trying to pull us, and I mean humanity, away from actually feeling human. And that would be my bridge towards First Nation and Indigenous in general. I mean, you're aware of that I sat for a while. I sat on a board of an Indigenous pipeline company, and I have a close friend who's from a band in Saskatchewan, and I followed his struggles through his last 10 years. And there's certainly a lot to say to the specifics of what happened to the First Nations here in Canada. But I would like to remind everybody that we were all Indigenous at one point. We all have Indigenous ancestors, and that is still alive in us. In the German culture, it was kept alive to the Grimm fairy tales. So to this day, I don't know about the current young generation, right? Because they have been socialized by TikTok and Instagram, so I can't speak to them. But certain in my generation, there was still an awe about the magic of the forest, for example, right? Like the birth of the Green Party in Germany, once that became a political force, was closely tied to pictures of the forest dying because of acid earth in the 80s. Like there were pictures in, mainstream media, and at the time that's what people were seeing, of 70% of the black forest sick. And that was a huge alarm bell that went off, and it really struck the German soul, because there was still this deep ancestral mythical connection to the forest, um, which speaks to the power of stories, right? Of how stories can bring us back to these ancestral truths. And one of the things that you have in Europe, for anybody that has European friends, or like, it doesn't matter if you're in Italy or in Britain or in Germany. It used to be, when I grew up in the 70s and the 80s, you would know from the accent where somebody was from. Like, within literally 30 seconds, I could tell you which city somebody was from. In the rural areas, people will know which village you're from, right? So there was still a very close relationship between the human and the land that they grew up in, right? Which I think in America, because not everybody, but everybody that's not indigenous is a settler, right? And so they moved around all over the place. So you have, like, even if you go to Italy, you have all these, regional preferences for kitchen and for music and for other things. So there's still, I think, this very core, like, connection to the land you grow up in, the fruits it bears, and all that. That's still alive in some areas of Europe, and I think it would be really sad if that was to go. That's one of the things that I always come back with when I go there is, oh, it's still there. They're still trying to keep it alive. And I just hope it survives the next generation. A little bit over 10 years ago, 12 years ago, when we were just getting ready to leave Toronto, and I had been laid off of my job, and I had some time because I had the luxury of unemployment insurance. And for a little while in my life, I was a journalist. I was a movie critic in Berlin. It's one of the topics Mark and I like to talk about, movies. Anyway, and I had the deep urge to write. I should write something again. And there was a local writing contest for a short story, and a close friend of mine and a spiritual guide for me suggested, well, write something about the most painful time in your life. And that made me stop for a while, because I couldn't really answer that question. Like, what was the most painful moment in my life? And after, meditating on it and going for long walks, I started to realize that it was the night that I walked away from my twins in Berlin. So the background story of that is, because of immense overthinking and cultural confusion and all kinds of other things, at the time, my wife and I were, I was living in California. She was living in Western Canada. And we madly fell in love, and we had beautiful times together. But we came from such different places, right? Not just culturally, but also pop culturally, right? Like, I just came out of this haze of the rave culture, that we couldn't feel comfortable in the relationship. She wanted to have children right away. I was like, there's no way I'm ready for that. Although I was already 31 at the time, 30, 31 at the time. Because the way I was raised was like, yeah, you got to go to college first, build a career, have a house, and then you can think about children, right? That's how I always thought about life. I don't, I've asked myself the question lately, where did this come from? But that's how I thought about it. Anyway, so I had all these preconceptions in my mind that Candace certainly wasn't going to stick to. And out of this struggle, we decided to call it quits. And I went back to Germany and tried to reconnect to the person I once was. Right? Looking back, that's obviously a silly idea, because that's not how life works. You can just like rewind 2 years and then. But I thought, being stupid, that's what I did, and then I reconnected with a former girlfriend of mine that I did have a deep relationship with when I was in my early 20s. and we were uncareful, and she got pregnant, and it was twins. And she said, I'm gonna have the kids. And I said, I can't do this with you. And it was really scary. I think it was the most scared I ever was in my life at the time, because rationally I was very aware of the consequence. Well, as aware as I could be, right? Obviously, there's stuff, millions of things I didn't realize, but I wasn't like drugged out of my mind or whatever. Like, I was, understanding much of the consequences of my decision. But at the same time, there was something beyond me that gave me a very firm guidance, and this is not, you cannot do this. Like, if you stay there and you try to live this life, you will ruin yourself and everybody around you. That was just very clear. And so then I had to walk that path, but I couldn't just walk away from it. So I was there for 2 months after they were born, and I helped out as much as I could, which was gut-wrenching, and tricky, and for everybody involved, right? Like, the experience was kind of like, oh, that's what they mean with karma. that was my experience. Like, it's like, that's what they mean with karma. Like, there was, and the other epiphany that I had is, there's a Christian saying that I love, which is, the path to hell is paved with good intentions. So that was, I had only good intentions, right? I broke up with Candace because it was like the right thing to do. I wasn't able to commit. So, a good man would just be frank about his intentions, right? And then I did all the other stuff. But the consequence was that I hurt everybody I loved, right? I hurt the mother of the children. I hurt my future wife. I hurt my mother, right? Because she had to watch me go through that. I hurt my father. I hurt all the friends that had expectations towards me. So it was a deep, deep teaching in understanding that your intentions alone are not a good guide for your life. And I ended up writing this over like a period of 3 weeks, and I cried. I sobbed, I should say. I didn't just cry. I sobbed every day, And I guess I discovered in that time that crying is a very important spiritual practice, right? It's also a healing practice. It's very akin to laughing, right? Like, if you don't laugh in your life, you'll eventually get sick. And I would argue the same happens if you do not cry. And certainly my experience. And, if you haven't seen it, Mark, you have to. The Song of the Sea. Do you know that movie?
I haven't seen it.
It's an Irish anime. It's an Irish animation movie. So I wrote this down because it starts with this verse. It says, "Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, for the world is more full of weeping than you can understand." Right? And in that, it's like you cannot, as a human, the human experience cannot make peace with the world until you weep about how the world is, because it is so much less than we want it to be, and so much more than we can handle, right? And we are constantly stuck in these thoughts about how we should make it better and how this shouldn't be, and how, right? And when you allow to really sink into that weeping of surrendering, right, completely to not only what is, but also to the pain that it causes, right? I think then that's a good place to really take your spiritual practice to the next level, right? As you know, I've been highly influenced by Buddhist thinkers, and there's these Buddhist Theravada monks that I listen to regularly, and I never understood the first noble truth, and the first noble truth is life is full of suffering, right? And if you talk to Christian people, it's like, oh, that's so negative. That's such it's such a nihilistic way to look at things. Right? And I'm like, no, it's not. It's a perfect place to start. Because if you try to talk yourself into how it's so hopeful, and what do you do with your suffering? Right? I have as I said, I have 3 sons. So one of my teenage sons, he was really caught in the teenage angst, and at some point I took him on a trip, and I told him that. I said, I'm very much aligned with the Buddhist belief system. You know what the most important first noble truth is? Life's full of suffering. And from that day on, it seemed to me like he was actually able to relax a bit, because he realized that there's nothing wrong with him.
Mhm.
Because he was angry at the world, right?
Mhm.
He was angry. He was disappointed. He was in fear. He was in, and you know what they do to young men these days, right? In school, they constantly tell them how they're less than, and how the female is the better sex, and all of that, right? So he thought and for him to realize, no, you're not alone. We all suffer, that was helpful. So yeah, I think that's what I have to say about that. Because, so that's the good vibes only movement, right?
Mhm.
I was in the cafe the other day at a pretty beautiful thing, good vibes only, right? So that's a, a declaration of war to the world, how it is. That statement right there, right? So it sounds like I'm just a peace loving. And I certainly was there, in my 30s, right there. That's where I was in my 30s. And I did not realize that what I'm really doing is trying to like press the world into my imagination on how it could be, right? That's what I was trying to do with the statement. Like, that's just not true. And if you spend enough time in nature, nature is such a healer in that regard, because all you need to do is watch predators, and then well, that is not the world we live in. The world we live in has predators, and there's predatory principles,